very warm welcome. Thank you for being here. You will realise that you are muted. I'm going to keep you muted during the talk, which we are recording. At the end, when we get to the questions, you can either put your questions in the chat and I can read them out, or if you'd like to ask it yourself and you don't mind being recorded doing that, then if you put your hand up, then I can unmute you. Thank you very much, Adam.
So I just wanted to start by saying thanks for having me here today. Really happy to receive this invitation. Seems like a very interesting group, and I hope that you find my presentation today interesting too. So just a very brief introduction to my research. Broadly speaking, my work falls into the domain of cultural evolutionary psychology. My work takes an interest in understanding the interactions between human psychology and the cultural institutions humans have created over the course of our history, and how they come to regulate human behavior, with a particular focus on how cultural institutions come to promote and sustain cooperation. And most specifically, the cultural institution that most of my work sort of centers around is religion. So typically, I find myself talking about my research to social psychologists who often find it quite surprising to learn and perhaps need reminding that the vast majority of the world considers themselves religious in some form or another. I suspect that this estimate of 84% of the world being religious will be perhaps less surprising to the group today. And I also usually spend a bit of time at the beginning of my talks justifying why religion, as a globally and historically pervasive feature of human life, is a psychologically interesting cultural institution to explore. But I will also spare you all those ramblings a little bit today. So instead, I'll provide a brief overview of the type of work I've been doing in this domain. Over the years, my research has attempted to identify the psychological foundations of religious and supernatural beliefs. So what features of the human mind allow for the easy representation of religious and supernatural concepts? My research has examined how participating in religious rituals makes groups more socially connected and cohesive, how belief in moralizing gods who care deeply about the affairs of human life helps sustain cooperation. And more recently, my work has asked questions as to how cultural diversity in religious beliefs and practices co-vary with different socio-ecological conditions, and how different religious systems around the world promote cooperation in light of different local socio-ecological challenges. So across my work and that of others in this area, what's really highlighted about religion are a few things that religions, I like to say, are really good at. One being organizing individuals into tightly cohesive communities, institutionalizing norms and cooperative networks that are often adaptive in light of changing socio-ecological conditions, and perhaps most importantly for the discussion today, also monitoring adherence to these norms. So from a psychological perspective, there seems to be something very special about the link between religious attitudes and beliefs and behavior, perhaps more so than in other typically studied groups of individuals in the psychological sciences. And this is what really brings me to what I want to talk about today, which is about how to get thinking about how the cooperative networks of religious communities around the world both already are and can be mobilized in sort of protecting our natural environments. So it should be no surprise here that the decades-long debate over the reality of anthropogenic climate change is, at least for scientists around the world, over. And of course, decades of communications about anthropogenic climate change has in many ways successfully sounded the alarm in many parts of the world. So a recent UNDP global survey of about 1.2 million people across 50 countries indicates that about 2/3 of the world's population is now convinced that climate change is a global emergency. So this is, of course, a huge success for environmental protection advocates and scientists alike. But it's also the case that recent enough evidence suggests that concern is globally a poor predictor of support for action. And that's just considering support for action, not even actual commitments to protecting the environment. So this attitude behavior gap is really not a novel idea, especially in the domain of pro-environmentalism. But this new evidence really highlights how the problematic gap where most of the data is sourced from in the United States, if you look at the top right point on this plot, is sort of where the gap is smallest, and it's actually much bigger in many other parts of the world. So this plot here is presenting the correlation between concern and support for action on the y-axis and country-level individualism scores on the x-axis. And what becomes clear when you look at this plot is that where individualism is low, which is often the case in many parts of the world, that also happen to be where anthropogenic climate change will have the most devastating effects, these are also places where the attitude behavior gap is the largest. So we have to stop and consider what the next steps will be for mobilizing communities in these parts of the world, as perhaps the current sounding of the alarm is not going to be effective enough. And what I'll be proposing here is that engaging with religious communities may prove to play an essential role in turning into concern into even devoted forms of commitments and action. So just a brief summary of why I think there's good enough evidence already for working with religious communities in this domain. One of the first things, again, is to remember that the majority of the world is religious. Second, the religiously unaffiliated is one of the only shrinking religious identities around the world. So while there will be more unaffiliated individuals in number by 2050, according to some predictions, they will represent a smaller proportion of the world's population. Whereas Christians, the current most populous religious identity, will continue to grow, and by 2050, Muslims are predicted to just about outnumber Christians globally. And evidence is sort of constantly accumulating in psychology now for how religion is a psychologically and culturally potent source of motivation for the majority of people on the planet. And there's a special interest in the particular emphasis on religion's capacity to sort of close the gap between beliefs, behaviors, norm adherence, and the monitoring thereof. And lastly, religious communities are already particularly cohesive and cooperative, which makes them perhaps ideal candidates for tackling socio-ecological threats. So now, of course, given the topic of this series, I'm definitely not the first person to be thinking about all of this, but bear with me while I go through some very cherry-picked examples. Pope Francis, for example, has very publicly, in his encyclical on climate change and inequality, made it very clear that caring for the environment is part of what being a good Catholic means or should be part of Christian identity. Here pictured a group of Buddhist monks in Thailand who have been ordaining ancient trees as monks to protect groves from deforestation. More locally, the Coventry Sikh Union is actively participating in the global Sikh movement to plant 1 million trees around the world as a spiritually motivated gift to the planet. And of course, religious systems also tie traditional communities to ancestral and sacred lands, to which communities and advocates for these communities will go to really great lengths to protect. And interestingly, some religiously motivated environmentalism is not necessarily intentional. So Eliza Kent is an anthropologist who studies the ecological consequences of religious beliefs and practices, amongst some other things, of course, has called some communities accidental environmentalists. So in these communities, decisions are made for religious reasons, such as protecting trees and groves from deforestation, perhaps because they believe to be the home to supernatural agents, as one example. But the protection of the supernatural agent leads to the conservation of local biodiversity in light of deforestation in nearby regions. So on the left here is quite a famous photograph of church grounds in Ethiopia, and on the right a map of sacred groves in India that are distributed throughout the country. All of which there's some actual decent empirical evidence of preserving biodiversity within these groves for at least the last 100 years. So empirically speaking, of course, some questions still remain, and that's really what the focus of the rest of my talk will be on. So for instance, to what extent do religious motivations for protecting the environment predict pro-environmental behavior? So to begin answering this question, I'll present the results of one study with data collected from a population of students at a Canadian university and a sample of Americans recruited from Amazon's MTurk, which is a crowdsourcing platform. So these two samples identified as mostly Christian or non-religious. Next, we might ask, are religious appeals for protecting the environment effective in increasing behavioral commitments? And here I'll present the results from a study I've done with 3 samples in Indonesia. So Muslims in Jakarta, Hindus living in Bali, and traditional Batak Christians living in the Toba Lake region of Indonesia. And lastly, globally, we can ask to what extent are religious systems becoming concerned with environmental issues and with what consequences? So as I was mentioning before the talk got started, in an alternate non-pandemic universe, I might have had all the data from this third project to present to you today, but in light of changing conditions, we've yet to start data collection, but I'll give you a brief overview of our plans for this third study towards the end of the talk. Okay, so let's move into study 1. And just to recap, the focal question of this first study is to empirically assess to what extent do religious and/or spiritual motivations for protecting the environment predict pro-environmental behavioral intentions and an actual measure of pro-environmental behavioral commitments. So this was a fairly exploratory study that included a number of different variables, of which I will only present a handful to you today. But we recruited 2 samples, one of students at the University of British Columbia, where I started this work during my PhD training, and the second recruited online on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, or MTurk. So both samples had about 800 participants, the American sample being older, given that it was not targeting students. And importantly, we recruited participants such that the sample was 50% religiously identified and 50% non-religious. Of those who were religious, the vast majority identified with a Christian denomination, unsurprisingly, given the North American cultural context. So as our focal pro-environmental outcome measures, we adapted 2 measures from the work of Bain and colleagues published in 2015. So the first is a fairly standard measure of self-reported behavioral intentions to behave in pro-environmental ways. So participants were asked to report how likely they would be in the next 12 months to perform 23 different behaviors, split roughly between 2 domains. So civic behaviors like voting for a green candidate in an election or joining protests, and more personal behaviors such as eating in season and local foods, conserving water at home, and recycling. So the 2 underlying domains here were highly correlated in this sample. So we did, for sake of brevity, especially in the talk, we collapsed these into a single measure of pro-environmental behavioral intentions. So to move slightly beyond this self-report measure and to start getting an actual measure of costly pro-environmental behavior, participants also completed this donation task. So in the study, participants were told that they had been entered into a raffle for a $150 for their participation. And we asked that if they were to win this raffle, would they be willing for us to donate some amount of this prize to a pro-environmental advocacy organization on their behalf? So there was a real raffle and somebody did win. Unfortunately, this person did decide to keep all the money for themselves, but that's neither here nor there. So with these 2 measures, we could examine whether participants both say they will act in pro-environmental ways and whether they are actually willing to pay a cost to behave pro-environmentally by looking at how much they were willing to donate some of their potential winnings to this environmental group. And as one indicator of religious motivations for protecting the environment, we asked participants one of two questions. So if participants identified as non-religious, we asked them, do you believe that you are morally obligated to do what you can to protect the natural world? And if they identified as religious, they were asked, do you believe that you are religiously obligated to do what you can to protect the natural world? Obviously, we didn't want to ask non-religious individuals about their religious obligations, so we tweaked the question slightly such that it was comparable, but also so that we could directly compare the effects of religious motivations to protect the environment in religious individuals to the effects of otherwise moral motivations in the non-religious individuals in our sample. And to keep things very nice and simple, if not a little crude, participants simply answered yes or no to these questions. So the idea here being, how does agreeing with one of these statements relate to people's behavioral intentions and their actual behaviors in the donation task? So what we find is that in the non-religious individuals, feeling a moral obligation was positively correlated with greater behavioral intentions to be pro-environmental, but this effect was small. And those that said they had felt morally obligated to do what they can to protect the environment also gave up more money in the donation task, just about $10 more than those who did not feel morally obligated. In the religious individuals, however, the effect of perceived religious obligations was much higher, although more variable. So note here the wider confidence intervals around the estimates. So religiously motivated individuals are self-reporting more pro-environmental intentions and willing to give up about twice as much of their potential windfall towards a pro-environmental organization. So this, I like to think, is really compelling evidence of the utility of appealing to religious communities about their religious motivations for protecting the environment, perhaps even as opposed to targeting the non-religious and their otherwise moral views. And of course, let's keep in mind the extent to which the religious outnumber the non-religious in most societies around the world. So something perhaps as simple as religiously appealing to people's desires or obligations to protect the natural world may be a good strategy. Okay, so an important question then is figuring out perhaps also how to tap into these types of concerns in other types of samples. And here we were also curious as to what else in our data set that we had measured tells us about what types of religious or spiritual beliefs best predicted these types of religious concerns. So our study was not necessarily designed for the purpose I'm going to use it for, so please take the next set of results with a grain of salt for the time being. But what we found is that in both religious and non-religious individuals, spiritual beliefs about nature, or what I'm tentatively calling Gaia beliefs, was one of the better predictors of moral and religious concern, respectively. So these Gaia beliefs were measured with 6 items in this study, with items such as I believe that everything in nature has a soul, and believing that nature is a spiritual resource. And to my surprise, really, endorsement on these items was resoundingly high across both the student and American samples, with practically everyone at least modestly agreeing with these statements. So that's scoring about the midpoint of the scale of a 4 and above. Excuse me. And so what I found perhaps even more surprising was how persistent endorsement of these spiritual beliefs were in different subsets of our sample. So here you have scores on the Gaia scale compared with self-reported religiosity and spirituality by political orientation. So unsurprisingly, given the North American cultural context here, conservatives on the right are more religious and spiritual than liberals on the left side of the plot here. But there's really little to no difference in endorsement of Gaia beliefs across the political spectrum. So I found this quite surprising, given how tied up religious beliefs and political orientation tend to be, and especially in the case of North American cultural context. And perhaps even more surprisingly, Gaia beliefs didn't differ much between self-identified atheists, so those who reject the existence of God altogether, and believers who do believe in a God or some gods. So again, we can see that unsurprisingly, atheists are less religious and less spiritual than believers, but the difference in Gaia endorsement is really markedly reduced. Okay, so from this first study, we have evidence that religious motivations are a potent correlate of pro-environmental behaviors, both self-reported and directly measured in the donation task, and that spiritual beliefs about nature are perhaps shockingly, I really do still find these results surprising, that these beliefs are so well distributed in different types of individuals, at least in this North American context. So I'm working with some collaborators at UBC for looking at these types of eco-spiritual beliefs and their correlates cross-culturally. So hopefully more on that soon. But of course, while this might be promising first evidence, it's still correlational. So experimental evidence of the potency of religious motivations for protecting the environment would still be very helpful. One test of which I will turn to now. So for study 2, we are moving to the other side of the world to talk about some data I've collected with my collaborators in Indonesia. So Indonesia is a particularly interesting population to study with regards to religious motivations for protecting the natural world for several reasons. For one, religion is mandated by law in Indonesia. Second, Indonesia is home to the world's largest Muslim population, but there remains some religious diversity in different parts of the country. Third, Indonesia is simultaneously one of the poorest performing countries in terms of many environmental performance indices, but is also a hotspot for potential regeneration of natural resources and particularly reforestation potential. And lastly, given that secular organizations are to some extent limited in Indonesia, most of the environmentalism occurring across the country is already in part religiously motivated. Okay, so for the focal question of study 2 here is, are religious appeals for protecting the environment effective in increasing behavioral commitments? So to answer this question, we sampled from 3 distinct religious populations from different regions of Indonesia. So Muslims living in Jakarta, Hindus living in Bali, and traditional Batak Christians living in the Toba Lake region. So samples were roughly 300 individuals per site. Individuals were similar in terms of age, gender, and formal education between these sampling sites, with the primary difference here being geographic location and, of course, religious affiliation. So expanding on the one-item index of perceived religious obligations to protect the environment that we had used in study 1, we deployed a 7-item scale that asked participants to rate their agreement with items like to protect nature is in line with God's will, and protecting nature is a religious obligation. At some point in the study, which I will explain in a few slides, participants were asked to read a religious appeal for environmental protection, which was drafted with the help of some local Islamic, Hindu, or Christian scholars. And as an example of what these looked like, here's the Hindu appeal. So I won't ask you to read the whole thing, but the Hindu religious appeal makes statements such as, man was looked upon as part of nature, linked by indissoluble spiritual and psychological bonds with the elements around him. The Hindu viewpoint on nature is permeated by reverence for life and an awareness that the great forces of nature are all bound to each other. The divine is not exterior to creation, but expresses itself through natural phenomena. And moves on to, directly appeal for environmental protection. Let us declare determination to halt the present slide towards destruction, to rediscover the ancient tradition of reverence for all life, and so on and so on. So in the Christian and Muslim samples, the text was obviously adapted to these different faith traditions, but conveyed a shared message for religiously motivated environmental protection. And lastly, we used a form of the donation task we had used in study 1, but here each participant was paid out the equivalent of a day's wage for participating in the study, and we asked whether they would be willing to donate some amount of these earnings to a local pro-environmental advocacy group. So in this study, the earnings were more real, as everyone actually got paid. There was no raffle. And giving up the earnings was much costlier than giving up the potential raffle win that we used in study 1. Excuse me. So procedurally, all participants first responded to the measure of religious motivations for protecting the environment. Then what happened next in the study depended on which condition participants had been randomly assigned to. So in the control condition, participants were first asked to complete the donation task, and then afterwards they read the religious appeal before answering some other questions. Whereas in the religion condition, participants read the religious appeal before completing the donation task. So with a simple change in the order of events here, we could compare donations before and after reading a religious appeal. So the results of this study really provide evidence for two things, and they're both pretty well communicated in this plot. So one, we replicate the correlation between perceived religious obligations and donations. So here you can see in the red line, in the control condition, donations were positively correlated with individual differences in religious motivations for protecting the environment. So the more people unprompted by a religious appeal, the more people felt that religiously obligated for protecting the environment, the more they were willing to give up in the donation task. The second piece of evidence we find here is that the religious appeal in the religion condition boosted donations to be at about 70%, no matter whether the participants themselves felt like they had a religious obligation to protect the environment in the first place. So not only are those who already feel religiously obligated to protect the environment more willing to behave pro-environmentally, but making religious motivations for protecting the environment salient can make otherwise less pro-environmental individuals more willing to behave in pro-environmental ways. So this is something, a result we were quite excited about, and hopefully, one day can have a meaningful impact in the world. We're still getting to that point, though. Okay, so that's a wrap on study 2. A replication of this exact paradigm in 4 additional cultural contexts is underway. So with Catholics in Brazil, Muslims in Bangladesh, Shintoists and Buddhists in Japan, and Hindus in India. We've just recently received the data, but I haven't had the time to look at it, nor to get it ready for a presentation, but I do very much look forward to doing that. And lastly, and very briefly, I'd like to talk about my forthcoming project that expands on all this work in a more vastly cross-cultural effort. In particular, this study will not only examine the consequences of religious motivations for protecting the natural world, as we've been doing in these other studies, but also how religious believers and communities come to have religious motivations for protecting the natural world in the first place. As mentioned earlier, I would have already had much of this data for the project and even had the luxury of traveling to warm places like Vanuatu for data collection, but the pandemic has put things on hold for the time being. And that's all I've got to present today. I just want to say a big thank you to my collaborators and funders who make all this work possible. And thanks to you all for listening, and of course for the invitation to present my work to you all today.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was absolutely fascinating. I know I have a few questions already, but maybe if I kick things off while other people are thinking about what they might like to ask. Anybody who has questions, can you either put them in the chat and then I can read them out, or if you put up your hand, when I say put up your hand, electronically put up your hand with the little hand icon at the top, and then I can unmute you if you'd like to ask your question aloud. So actually, the first question I wanted to ask you is sort of a background question, which is to do with the whole concept of being religious or not religious. Because one thing that I found, having actually in my life gone from being not religious to being religious, is that people do tend to sort of draw this line down the middle and say, well, you know, all religious people of all different types of faiths and denominations and backgrounds and beliefs are all in this category religious, and those who aren't are in this category not religious. And that those of us who are religious are sometimes expected to speak on behalf of, you know, as a Christian, sometimes I get asked questions that make me think, well, are you expecting me to speak on behalf of Muslims and Buddhists? And
Right.
not really sure that I can do that. So first, I actually just wanted to kind of slightly challenge you on the validity of the concept of religious versus non-religious. And I sort of wondered if you could expand on that from the sort of psychological or the sociological perspective.
Sure. Yeah. So one, I would say, you know, these are in this data set, these are people self-identifying as one or the other. So I'm not imposing this structure on them. They are willingly saying, I'm religious or I'm not religious. In terms of what that means to these people, I think some of the data on, you know, the Gaia beliefs shows that being not religious does not mean you are not partaking in the supernatural in some meaningful way. Perhaps you are just not, you know, identified with the existing major religious affiliations. So in terms of what we were trying to get to in this study, the first study at least, we're really just using it as a way to tailor the question about obligations. But more broadly, I would say we don't know a whole lot about non-religious worldviews in terms of, you know, meaning making and spirituality and these sorts of things. But I think the border is much less clear cut than some social psychology or sociology would seem. You know, the Richard Dawkins of the world, who sees this as a very thick boundary. Turns out, I think, you know, most non-practicing, non-religious people do not succumb to the type of atheism that, you know, someone like Richard Dawkins has. There's a lot more gray area that I think the psychology as a science is only recently catching up to, you know, making sense of. I don't know if that's a useful answer to that question, but
yeah, no, it is very useful. One of my colleagues, the chaplain of St Hugh's, Sean, is doing some work on. He calls them the religious nuns, and this confuses me because I always think he means nuns, N-U-N, and he means N-O-N-E-S. But that this is actually a very broad category of people, and certainly what I've found is that depending on the context, you can get people saying they're not, you know, and it'll be interesting to see how the census comes out. You can get people saying they're not religious, or you can get people saying that they're Christian within this context, because it has a cultural meaning. And when you ask people whether they're religious, they might say, oh, I'm not religious. But then they can be sort of Christian not religious, or they can be atheist not religious, sort of. So
yeah.
I think there is a lot, an interesting thing there.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more nuance than what, you know, the sort of dinky little items we were asking people capture. That's definitely the case.
And so, sorry, is somebody,
Yeah,
Makbul, speaking?
I
Sorry.
just wanted to see whether, you know, I think I came across a study where there was an attempt to measure religiosity through an index. To actually say, okay, how do you define religiosity? And what are the things that will determine whether you are, you know, conforming to your own self-selected category of religiosity? And therefore, you know, he said, okay, do you set it out in terms of beliefs? Do I believe in these things? Do I do these things? So there's a belief thing, and then there is actual practice of these beliefs. And I think it's quite interesting because I think there's a good dimension. I thought your study, you know, Adam's study was absolutely fascinating. But I think that there are some areas to be looked at. So, you know, I know that when someone was running some kind of an environmental kind of session, they said, okay, we are going to treat you like some Indonesian landowners, you know, and ask you whether you are prepared to sell this land for forestry logging project. And, you know, what will make you do that? And what will refrain you from doing that? What's the point? What would you do in order to would you say, okay, I need to provide for some kind of reforestation. I need some kind of guarantees that if I give up my land for this, there'll be something that will be made good, made good as a result of that. So I think those are, so the basic question therefore is, when someone says, I believe, or someone says, I am so and so, there is something more to be, deeper to be examined. And how do you test that? And so I think that one can best test this by asking people, are you prepared to do certain things that show that you are actually prepared to live up to these beliefs, environmental protection beliefs. I just wanted to get Adam's reaction to the kind of dynamics that might be there in that kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a lot of really interesting points, and gives me an opportunity to seriously caveat my results here, in the sense that this is in the confines of an experimental study in an artificial situation. In Indonesia, we had groups of people coming out of church, and then they all sat down on the ground and answered some pen and paper surveys. It's a very non-real situation. And seeing the sort of real world applications is hard even for me, something that I would love my work to have real world applications. But in terms of your questions about, measuring different types of religiosity and what that means, I do think that the field is heading towards the more specificity, the better, right? There's sort of an older tradition in psychology, at least, about broadly measuring religiosity. How religious are you? And realize that doesn't really get us much traction. What really comes down to is the specific consequences of specific types of beliefs, participation in different types of rituals, how close you are with what types of communities, and your cultural context and all these sorts of things. But yeah, I don't have a good answer as to what the dynamics look like in that type of specific situation. It's obviously all much more complicated than my studies get at. Again, I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but I hope it's somewhat helpful.
That's right. Thanks a lot. I mean, the only thing I would add is, if you look at Bhutan, there is a happiness index. So right. You see, these kind of indices are quite interesting, that you try to define and measure. And of course, in the case of Bhutan, it has become national policy. It has been underpinning of a national policy to create conditions that will make you conform to the happiness index.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Thank you for that.
I was going to ask something actually about sort of how motivation works, and I think Michael and your response touched a little bit on this thing about social groups and social context. To what extent are the religious motivations that motivate people to act in pro-environmental ways, to what extent are they internal? Like, I personally think, that this is my religious duty. And to what extent is it partly about a sense of social pressure or internalized social pressure? And I say this partly because I'm very aware that I behave slightly differently. I shouldn't. I behave slightly differently when I'm wearing this collar, because I'm aware that people, that I'm representing my faith. And so I think if I was answering a survey and I was first asked whether I was religious, I would automatically be thinking, I'd better give proper Christian answers here, hadn't I? Yeah, sorry, I'm just remembering now a survey that John, one of your collaborators, sent round, where I got to the end of it and realised that I'd given answers that were entirely compatible with being an atheist, and sort of slightly panicked. So I wonder to what extent, how you, or whether it even matters to distinguish between whether that's a false distinction that I'm making there.
So I definitely do not think it's a false distinction. In terms of producing the desired outcomes here, being someone being pro-environmental, I am maybe thinking that it doesn't matter so much. And to sort of build on that, so this empirical behavioral science literature on sustainability and sustainable decision makings, especially that comes out of the Western world, is riddled with this behavior action gap. And I think the size of that behavior action gap is largest in places where people think too much about their own individual desires and motivations, and perhaps not enough about the strong cultural norms or, that regulate behavior in different contexts. So I think in the context of reaching out to religious communities in the global sense, in a global population, if, somebody can tap into those strong feelings of needing to follow the norm, and the norm is to protect the environment, then I think it could be even more powerful than an internal desire to, really contribute to the saving the world or whatever it is. But completely open avenue for future research, disentangling these in different contexts, in places like the UK, it might require turning that into a personal motivation and less rule following. But trying to think about what is going to work in the most places simultaneously. I think that's a really, you bring up a really interesting point.
Yeah, actually, could you clarify? Because I don't think I quite followed that bit where you had that graph that was about the correlation between individualism and the gap. So there was three factors. There was individualism, and then there was the gap between your concern about the environment and your support for actual action. But I couldn't work out which way around the correlation was. So could you just repeat that again?
Yeah, so the plot was individualism on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis was the correlation between I'm concerned about this and I do something about it in different places. And what it was finding is that in more individualistic places, the link between your concern or your attitude and your behavior is stronger. So there's less of a gap.
That's what I thought you said, and it kind of surprised me because I was expecting you to say the opposite.
Right. So that's the real problem, right? Is we know that this gap is so problematic, but the places we've studied it in are actually where the gap is the smallest. So when it comes to thinking about, how to enact to close the gap between beliefs and behaviors in sub-Saharan Africa, most of the literature is totally, unaware of what it's going to take to do there.
But that seems. Do you have any explanation as to why that might be? Because from what I was just saying, I would have sort of imagined that a culture that has a greater sense of sort of social solidarity or of sort of subsuming oneself for the greater good would have, would be most likely to act on those beliefs. But is it that basically individual motivation, if it's not an individualistic society, individual motivations just don't count for very much? Is that what it is?
I think it's part of that. In places that are less individualistic, there tends to be strong norms about how you are to act in different situations. So there, the crux might be changing the norm or the perceived norm to get people to act in line with those norms. Whereas it doesn't really matter what you believe. You've been told your whole life that this is what happens when you enter into this situation and these types of things.
So actually, when we think about the way, this is something we've been talking about in some of the other sessions, the way that behaviour changes in say the UK setting, and one of the examples that I raised in one of these other groups was how a vegan lifestyle has gone from being very, very sort of extreme and really quite difficult because it wasn't sort of facilitated really to coming to be very mainstream, and I'd probably a huge number of other changes like that, that actually getting to that tipping point is much harder if those sort of pioneers, those first people who change their behavior, have to push against a much stronger sense of cultural solidarity.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say absolutely. I don't have any hard evidence, but that would be my intuition. You can imagine that as something becomes slightly more practical or possible, then something can benefit from all sorts of cultural transmission dynamics. People start seeing their favorite influencers becoming vegan and celebrities, and there's all sorts of prestige bias, and then it gets to spread and perhaps one day become the norm, right? Especially if there is then top-down, influence in the sense of, if the Pope or the Bishop of the Church of England tomorrow said, no more eating meat, like, would everyone listen? That would be an incredible way to have a huge effect on, agricultural systems. I don't expect that to happen, but, there's all sorts of bottom up and top down processes here. Yeah.
Marie, I've just made you into a presenter, so you should now be able to unmute yourself.
Sorry, but it was on that same conversation you were having about the individualism and so on, and this might be a bit of a wormhole or something, but I was very interested in that bit, and I noted on there, just by chance, there were probably other examples, but the below the line was Norway, and above the line was Finland. And I just thought it was kind of interesting because they're two countries that are very, obviously very close in proximity, and I think we think of Norway, at least Sweden, being very, well, I just wondered if you had a comment on that, why those feature like that, and it was rather surprising, I thought. And maybe there's more interesting sort of other examples of countries that or surprising events like that you found.
Yeah, so so just to be clear, it's not my data that has generated.
No.
So I actually have not noticed, but I am equally fascinated as to what the explanation for the difference in Norway and Finland is. I don't have a good answer.
No.
I think we're now in the stage in psychology where this cross-cultural work is becoming a little bit more easier, and there's all this good data for measuring cultural variation out there. But it's slowly but surely people will start accounting for that variation more than just displaying it. But I don't have a good answer for you now. Maybe one day.
It was really curious, I think, because you think of these countries as being quite similar and obviously have quite dissimilar outcome there.
Yeah. I would suggest very much reading the paper it came from. It is a very interesting read. If you email me, I can send it to you if you didn't take a note.
I didn't. Thank you. I will.
I would like to see the correlation between eco-theology and eco-science and see exactly what it does to motivation. In other words, how people are, when you measure what is motivating people, is it the religiosity, religious faith, etc., science, and then look at it in the context of whether it represents altruistic motivation or it represents some form of self-interest, both in terms of preservation or protection against harm, and then to see exactly how the whole thing would look in terms of motivation to actually practicing one's beliefs. So I just thought Adam might want to, if I've clarified my question.
Yeah, no, I completely understand, and I think it's an excellent point, and it provides me with an opportunity to talk a little bit more about this third project that hasn't undergone yet. So this project is being funded by the Templeton Foundation on a project about science and religion as potentially competing meaning systems. So part of this project will be to directly compare the effectiveness of religious versus scientific appeals in these different places, with the hypothesis that the more, the religious communities I'm sampling from have already sort of pushed their concerns to be about climate change, that actually the religious appeal will be more effective in these places than what is, a traditionally scientific-based appeal. So I think I will one day have data on the first part of your question. The second part I think is absolutely fascinating, about figuring out, why people are interested in partaking in this, because there's plenty of good selfish reasons to be pro-environmental in the right context. And I don't think I know enough about that literature to make a reasonable comment, but I think that's a super interesting way to start partitioning variance and motivations here. I think that was a really, really interesting point. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. I'll be very interested to hear about that when it comes out. There was
Hopefully
one.
It happens. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll keep praying. One other question that sprung to my mind, partly because of what you were saying about those, what you call the Gaia beliefs, but also because of what we were talking about. How do you actually define religion and what counts as religious? Would you ascribe to the idea that some people have posited that actually environmentalism, it's in a strong committed sense, has become essentially a religion, or it sociologically or psychologically holds the position of a religion and sort of fulfills some of those same functions and operates in some of the same ways for those people who are really committed to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if that's the case, it should perhaps continue to do so, without doing so explicitly, as to not, scare off the people who, just can't do anything to do with religion. But I mean, the sort of cultural evolutionary sciences on religion have, identified all sorts of reasons as to, why religions are so pervasive in the world. Why do people still flock to all different types of beliefs and practices? And it's mostly, because of the adaptive advantages it provides communities. So if environmentalism can mimic or piggyback off that sort of, momentum that humans are so, drawn to in many ways, even just at a low level psychological thing, by all means, like it should, right? Whether it needs to be explicitly a religion, I do think that there's something quite powerful about tying norms to supernatural beliefs about monitoring and punishment, and what it means to be a good insert category here, and meeting those norms is very powerful. And if as a affiliation or as an identity, environmentalism can do that, I think all the better, would be my prediction.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? No. Well, thank you ever so much. That was fascinating. And thank you very much as well to you and your collaborators for letting us put it online.
Yes.
And I very much look forward to, well, it sounds like you very much look forward to your research actually happening, but I very much look forward to hearing the results of that and hearing a bit more from you in the future, I hope.
Yeah, I would love to, stay in touch. Sounds like a very good group that you've got together here. So I'm happy to take part. Thanks again for the invite.
Thanks a lot. God bless.
Bye.
Bye-bye.